Hello and welcome to my video presentation on how to use a FMEA, failure modes effects analysis, in a technical problem solving scenarios. So typically, what is a FMEA? A FMEA in general is an analysis tool that is designed to identify the failure modes and their effects on a system design. They are traditionally used during the design phase of a system in a bid to understand the predictability of the components within a larger system. A traditional FMEA is more design based. It goes into the various components within a system to better understand the lower level components, whereas a technical FMEA, such as the one that I'm going to present here, is more towards understanding the reliability of a particular system. As a result, it is not as detailed as a traditional design-based FMEA, and I will be going over a design of how to go over this in the second lecture. So, a FMEA is designed to look at the interactions of subsystems and the effects on the system reliability. This is important because we can use a technical FMEA in technical problem solving to highlight the potential problem space based upon where a problem may arise, based upon the symptoms that we can define within a FMEA. I traditionally like to use a FMEA type system before I do problem solving, so that as I do my problem solving over time, I can relate the findings to a larger context and create troubleshooting or problem solving information that can be used later on. It's also used to help provide context to the problem solving. So the general FMEA steps that we use are as follows. The first, you want to state the purpose of the system that's being analyzed. This is important because it aids in the understanding of how this system relates to the larger system. Because sometimes you may see something that occurs during problem solving and you may want to know, is that normal or is that abnormal? So understanding how the system that you are trying to problem solve functions within the larger system is a very important part of problem solving and a larger part of a design of a technical FMEA design as well. Then the second step we're going to do is create or find a simplified schematic or diagram of the system that you are problem solving. And this is important because we are going to use this diagram to understand all of the potential failure modes that could be caused within the system based upon the current design. What I've also done with this is once you do this basic simplified diagram, once you do the failure modes, maybe you may be able to also find ways to improve how a system is tested. One of the steps that we're going to go through with this is identify how each step will be tested. Sometimes you could identify deficiencies in a test plan by using one of these, by basically understanding that certain parts of the system may not be adequately tested. So therefore, by using a FMEA, you can identify these deficiencies and then plan a test plan to better test a system. So number 3, we're going to list all the components on the left-hand column of a FMEA chart. The FMEA chart that I use is abbreviated. I'm going to show you the chart during this video. And basically, what you do is you list all the components on the left-hand column. The second column is going to list all the possible failure modes for each component. Once you have all the components listed, at that point we will go to step 4, where you list all the possible failure modes for each component. And these are failure modes, not necessarily states of operation. So for instance, for a switch, you would have like open or shorted. And you would go for each of your components to state the possible failure modes for each of the components. What this does is allows you to later analyze how each potential failure mode for each individual component affects the overall system. This allows you to understand at a later date how each of the components can influence what you are seeing as a symptom when you're problem solving. To help explain how a technical FMEA works in relation to problem solving, I've created a simple system that we can use to kind of go through the steps here. This is a waveguide pressurization system, and generally this is used to pressurize waveguides in a radar system so that moisture or particles cannot get into the waveguides. It consists of course, the transmitter that transmits RF energy, the antenna that receives it, and then when the RF goes out and hits the target, it comes back to the antenna, and the RF travels through a waveguide to a receiver that receives it, and then it just interprets and deciphers what is received. So the waveguide pressurization system is basically operated by, you have an air pump which pumps air into the waveguides, and generally it always pumps pressure above the outside pressure so that the pressure differential is always greater outside the waveguides. And you have low pressure switch and high pressure switch. Low pressure switch opens when the pressure is low. High pressure switch opens when the pressure is high. In some systems it could be swapped. It just depends on the type of system. You have an analog to digital computer that determines what the state of the waveguides is. If the low pressure switch opens up, the analog to digital computer will turn on the air pumps to pressurize it. If it is too high, it will turn the air pumps off so that the excess pressure doesn't damage the transmitter or the receiver internal components. And then we have indicators. Some cases these may be a digital indication like a screen or something like that, but in this example I'm going to use like light bulbs. Just so if the low pressure switch opens up, the low pressure indicator light comes on, and vice versa for the high pressure indication. If there's high pressure, the high pressure switch opens and the high pressure indicator turns on. And down here I just included a little schematic. Sometimes in some of these technical FMEAs you could use a schematic. I like to use a simplified diagram because if I'm trying to explain a system to someone who is not as skilled as I am in the system, a simplified diagram helps to simplify the context. But for more senior or more skilled technicians, I may want to use a schematic. You know, in general, one of the steps that you're going to do in creating a testing and troubleshooting plan is you will describe the system in detail. And sometimes having a schematic is more helpful. It just depends on your audience, once again. I've actually used both sometimes. I've used a simplified diagram for more junior technicians, but then also later on for the more difficult problems, I may use a schematic that has more detail. Here is a sample technical failure mode effects analysis failure mode worksheet. It's very general, and in many cases you may find that yours may expand or be smaller depending upon how you want to do it. But in general, this is basically the minimum that you need to have. The first box is general purpose statement. You're going to state the purpose of the system as it relates to the larger system. This helps provide context for the problem solver so that he or she may understand the reason the system is there and how it interacts with a larger system. Because many times the interactions with a larger system can help explain the symptoms that you're seeing. You may also have a box that shows normal operation. Whenever I create my testing and troubleshooting worksheets, I like to have a simple box that states basically how the system works. So this provides even more context for the problem solver. So if the person understands how it works, they may be able to understand how a failure state that they are seeing relates to the system that they are working on and the larger system as a whole. And these are the four general categories that you want to have in a technical FMEA. For those of you who have used a design-based FMEA, you'll notice this is much simpler than a design FMEA. Once again, we're not trying to understand the feasibility of a particular design. We're trying to provide information on all the possible failure states. So I strip out all of the design-related fields that you would use in a more detailed design-based FMEA. So you have the component that is within the system. You are going to list every component, and then you're going to list every possible failure state, how that failure is observed, what symptoms would you see if you see this failure state, and then how are we going to test for it? How are we going to deduce how to fix a problem. In some cases, you may not list all the failure states. I use these as living documents. So in the future, if I find a failure that has occurred that I've never seen before, I just add it. So that's important to understand that you're not going to catch every single failure state of every component, or you may not. If you are doing one that you've done a lot of work on and you have a lot of documentation on, you may catch the lion's share. The main thing is to catch the 80% as Pareto would recommend. Catch the most likely or most important components and failure states, and then over time, as you do your testing and troubleshooting, you can add to this statement, to this document as you go. Okay. Now, when I create my testing and troubleshooting document, I will actually place this in the front of all my troubleshooting documents so that it provides a table of contents. And in the next video, I'm going to show how to create a testing and troubleshooting plan, in which case you'll get even more understanding of how this relates to how we test and troubleshoot a system. Here is a completed waveguide pressurization FMEA that I've created for to help understand possible failures. Now, once again, I have a purpose and a general normal operation. Once again, normally it'd be a lot more detailed than this, but for our purposes, this is good enough. I'm not going to read this for you. You can feel free to read this if you like. Once again, this is only an example. Now, in here, as you'll see, I've listed every component that was on the simplified diagram. Okay, so I'm just going to slightly go through all of these just to show you. And with each component, I basically list every possible failure state. Now, once again, as this is an example, I may not have caught every single possible failure state, but basically I've caught the big ones that I feel, just with a quick review, the most important ones that, as I've worked on systems like this, that I've seen. So if you see ones for this type of system and you're familiar with it, I understand. Just realize that this is just for example purposes. So, and now we have the observed failures. So this is how we observe the failure. And as you're going to notice, you may see the same observed failure repeat every time. That's because multiple components can cause the same observed failure. Like, for instance, if a cracked or leaking seal in the waveguide assembly can actually cause the same systems as if there's an internal leak or loose fitting in the transmitter, receiver, or antenna. So in many cases, you'll have a tiered testing plan. In this case, I like to list them from most likely to least likely. So in this case, as you notice, these are says same as waveguide assembly crack, blah, blah, blah. So you will see here that the test procedure is exactly the same, but the steps that you do are slightly different based upon the component. For example, in the waveguide assembly, you perform a waveguide pressurization test. If the test fails, then replace the waveguide assembly or seals. Now, let's say that you've already done that and you test it again and it fails again. Now you would go to the next most likely one. In this case, the transmitter would be most likely. Then you could, in this case, you would cap off the transmitter waveguide and retest. If the test passes, that tells you that the leak is related to the transmitter. In real life, it could be connection between the waveguide assembly and the transmitter. But for this example, we're just going to say that it's the transmitter. Same thing with the receiver and the antenna. In this case, the antenna would be the least likely place that it leaks. You could create a more detailed troubleshooting plan where you basically can cap off everything off the waveguide and then connect one at a time until it leaks. Whatever, it just depends on how you want to test a system. But this is basically so that a newer person can understand how to troubleshoot, someone who doesn't have experience with this type of system. And then I have the air pump. If you see this observed failure. So basically, in our test plan that I'm going to show in the next video, you'll have all the observed failures is going to be your main category. And then you basically will list the components one at a time. So in your test plan, you would just go down to what you see, and you would do whatever it says. So these are all observed failures for each of these components. For the air pump, I've got 3 failure states. Either you have an internal leak, worn diaphragm, or loose fitting. Or you have the pump is always on or the pump is always off. So, and it'll cause these symptoms, the things that you see. So, and I did this for every one of the components in here. Now, as I mentioned, you may not see every failure mode, and you may not include every component. Like, for instance, I didn't include wiring. You can create your own category for wiring, or you could include the wiring under each of the components that it connects to. Depends on how detailed the system is. But you may forget other components that may not be in your simplified diagram, which is fine. Over time, you may do maintenance, and you may realize that you are missing something, in which case you just go in, add that component, add the failure mode that you saw, how you fixed it, and then create a guide for it. And it's that simple. So I hope that this helped you understand how a technical FMEA works in relation to fault isolation, or as we say, technical problem solving. Same thing. In these videos, you're going to hear the words problem solving, fault isolation, and troubleshooting used intermittently. Although there are just minute differences between the three, in general, these are all going to be the same. So when the differences make a difference in what we're doing, I will state those differences in the video. I hope this was helpful, and please feel free to look at my part 2 of this series. I will also leave a link for a work domain analysis. I'm going to create a video on the work domain analysis, but I will go ahead and add a link for the work domain analysis video that I created for an operations management class that I teach. So I hope this has been helpful, and please feel free to leave your comments, and I will be more than happy to get back to them whenever I see them. Thank you very much.